What we're going to be going over here is manufacturing overhead costs and variances, but we're going to be specifically looking at the fixed overhead portion of this, our manufacturing overhead here, and we're going to be calculating the variances for this fixed overhead. And our example is going to be based on a standard costing system with a flexible budget. So let's look at it in terms of a department here within a manufacturing plant, and we're going to be working with the fixed overhead here for this department. So what I've shown here, I've got it laid out in T account form, and we're going to look at the flow of this fixed overhead through these T accounts. We're going to make the calculations here to determine those variances. So conceptually what we do here, we start with the actual fixed cost here that we have for the period, and let's just say it's on a monthly basis here. And then those fixed costs are going to flow into a manufacturing overhead control account here. And I'm going to showing it as a fixed overhead control account here because that's specifically what we're looking at. But it would go into this manufacturing overhead control account, and then it would flow into our work in process control account. But it's going to flow in at the standard cost in this case. So what's going to happen here, the standard cost that we have is going to vary. It's going to be different here than the actual fixed overhead costs we have for the period. So the difference between the standard that we have set for the period here and our actual costs are going to be divided between, in this case, the spending variance here for the fixed overhead and also what they call the production volume variance here for the fixed overhead. Okay, so before we get into our calculations here, let's first go down here and look at, we'll start with our reference key here. So I'm showing in red here the letters here for those calculations that we're going to make. And the SVOR, that would stand for our standard variable overhead rate, but we're not using it in this example. Then we get down to SFOR, that stands for the standard fixed overhead rate. AHU is the actual hours used. SHA, standard hours allowed. And then DH, that's our total budgeted direct labor hours for the period. And those are referred to as the denominator hours here because they fit into the denominator here on our formula here for calculating our standard fixed overhead rate. Okay, so how would we go about calculating our standard fixed overhead rate? Well, basically what you do, you take your total fixed cost that you budgeted for the period, in this case for the department, and you divide it by the total direct labor hours that you budgeted for the period. And that's all on budgeted amounts here. So you divide your total fixed cost here for the period here based on a budgeted amount here divided by, again, a total direct labor hours, and that's going to give you your standard fixed overhead rate on a per hour basis. So say for our example, our total fixed cost was set at $240,000, and we determined our budgeted total labor rate that we're going to go through this department would be 4,800 hours. So the division here is going to give us $50 per hour here would be our standard fixed overhead cost. So for every direct labor hour that you spend, $50 here would be assigned to your fixed overhead rate or fixed overhead cost. Okay, so looking at it in terms of, say we have a labor rate here, a standard of $15 per hour. So divide that into your standard fixed overhead rate of $50 per hour. So you're going to have 333% here times your labor rate here is going to equal your fixed costs for our calculation here. So you look at it in terms of calculating it here in terms of direct labor. Say, for example, you have $7 spent here in direct labor. You take it times 333%, which is your percentage here for your standard fixed overhead rate. 333% times the $7 direct labor hour is going to give you $23 here in fixed overhead cost that you have. So that's basically how it works. Usually you work with some percentage here when you're talking about those standard fixed overhead rates. It's some percentage times your whatever direct labor dollars you have. That'll give you your fixed overhead that you'll be looking at. So that's how it works here as a percentage. Okay, so let's go up and let's look at our problem here. So starting with our fixed overhead, we start with our actual cost here, and our actual cost in this example is $242,500 for the month that we're looking at in this department. Then that's going to flow into our manufacturing overhead control account here at $242,500. And then I made one other calculations here, and that's going to be for this volume variance that we're going to be looking at. So and that's going to be $240,000. That's simply taking your standard fixed overhead rate, $50 per hour, times your total budget direct labor hours, and those we call that denominator hours here, that we have calculated at 4,800 hours. So $50 the standard fixed overhead rate times those 4,800 hours, 4,800 hours, excuse me, is $240,000. Okay, so now we take and we move into our working process where we're going to record our standard cost here based on for those fixed costs. So that is simply taking your standard fixed overhead rate, $50 per hour, times your standard hours allowed. That's our standard rate that we're looking at for this month here in that department, and that is 4,000. So that gives us our standard cost. $50 times 4,000 gives us our standard cost for our fixed overhead for the month here is $200,000. Now we're going to compare that to our actual costs here, $242,500, and we can also compare it to the $240,000 here based on our denominator hours here that we have for the period to determine our volume variance. So first off, let's look at our fixed overhead spending variance. And that, okay, let's look at that here. So that is where we take our actual fixed cost here for the period, and then we would subtract our budgeted amount here based on our standard fixed overhead rate, $50 per hour, times what we have budgeted, those denominator hours here, there's total direct labor hours here, 4,800 hours. That's going to give us $240,000. So the difference here, $242,500, is actual hours is greater than what we budgeted here at 240,000 hours. So this is where we're going to get the spending variance. It's going to be an unfavorable variance here of $2,500 simply because our actual amount that we have spent here for the period in a fixed overhead is greater than our budgeted amount. So it's unfavorable by the difference here, $2,500. Okay, so that takes care of our spending variance here. Now let's move over to our production volume variance. And that's really based on looking at our calculations here where we have taken our standard cost for the period here of $200,000 and compare it to our denominator, or what our total direct labor hours that we're looking at, 4,800. So we're really looking at the difference between the 4,000 hours here as a standard cost here and the 4,800 hours here based on our total direct labor that we budgeted. Okay, so let's go and look at that. So our production volume variance, we're going to calculate that to be 40,000 here is unfavorable. And that's simply taking, again, our denominator hours here, total direct labor hours that we budgeted for the period of 4,800, and subtract that from the standard hours allowed here. That's for our standard. We only allow 4,000 for the period, so the difference is 800 hours here times standard fixed overhead rate here of $50. So there we come up with our production volume variance, as they call it, debited here for 40,000 as unfavorable because our total direct labors that we budgeted for the period here were greater than the standard hours allowed here. Okay, so that gives us our production volume variance. So now so our total variance, let's just look at it here. So our total variance, the 2,500 here, unfavorable spending variance, plus the 40,000 here, our production volume variance, as they call it, equals $42,500. So, and you can see that up above here. And it's unfavorable. Everything was unfavorable here, as it turned out in our problem. So $42,500 unfavorable, and you can see that looking at our T accounts up here. So our actual cost of $242,500, compare it to the $200,000 here based for our standard cost in our working process here. So you can see the difference is that $42,500. Okay, so that's how that works. So we can also looked at why we calculated this denominator hours here times that standard fixed overhead rate of 240,000 we came up. Compare that to our work in process, our standard cost here, 200,000. So we got a $40,000 difference, unfavorable again, 40,000 here. So debited here for 40,000. Now just looking at our debits and credits here to see how everything balances out. So taking our debit here at 200,000 here for our based on our standard cost here, and then add to it our debit here 40,000 in our production volume variance. That brings us up to 240,000, and then we'd have to also add our debit here in our fixed overhead spending variance of 2,500. So that brings us up to exactly what we have here in actual cost at $242,500. Okay, so that's how we handle these using our T account approach here, along with the equations we went through here to determine our spending variance and our volume variance. And that was, again, simply the difference here. We looked at our actual fixed overhead costs for the period and compared it to the standard fixed overhead cost that we had allowed for the period. So you can see that's how we got those two different variances, split between our fixed overhead spending variance and our production volume variance. And just to understand that. So again, maybe just understand this 4,800. I've got it shown here. This 4,800 hours. Those were the total direct labor hours here that we budgeted for the period, and we use that in both our fixed spending variance here for our comparison to determine our fixed overhead spending variance, and we also use it in our production volume variance here. Spending variances were based on the actual fixed overhead costs we have for the period compared to the standard fixed overhead rate times that $4,800 budget, 4,800 hours that we budgeted for the period. So we took our actual fixed overhead cost here, compared it to the budgeted amount, the total number of hours that we budgeted, and that gave us our fixed overhead spending variance. And then our volume variance, that simply became the difference in those hours that we looked at. Those total budgeted hours here, the 4,800 that we have, less our standard hours that we determined would be our standard for the period of 4,000 here. So we only planned to spend 4,000, our standard was set up, to spend 4,000 here. We budgeted 4,800 total direct labor hours. The difference gave us that production volume variance. Okay, so the total between and make a point here talking about unfavorable and favorable here. When we have an unfavorable variance, we debit it here. And versus if we have a favorable variance, that is, a favorable variance is where you're actually spending less than your budgeted here, then you would have a favorable variance. In this case, we were spending more here. Actual expenses here were more than what we had budgeted, so we debited here as an unfavorable amount. And then same with our production volume variance. Had we favorable, we would have credited here because we would have actually had a greater, our standard hours allowed would have been greater than our direct labor or direct denominator hours that we're looking at here. And then in that case, it would have been a favorable, a credit here. Okay, so you can understand the difference between unfavorable and favorable. Unfavorable, you're over budget. Favorable, you'd be under budget. And then again, just the difference here between our fixed overhead spending variance here plus our production volume variance should explain the difference between our standard cost that we have budgeted for the period versus our actual cost we have for the period. Okay, so that'll summarize it here for this fixed overhead, where we looked at just the fixed overhead portion of our manufacturing overhead.